They called him Father Samuel, though none of the 12 children locked in his church basement were his biological children. And by 1869, none of them could remember their real parents or their lives before Father Samuel brought them to the Redemption Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. The youngest was 4 years old and had been in the basement for 2 years. Half her life spent in darkness, learning to recite scripture, while Father Samuel beat her with a leather strap whenever she made mistakes. The oldest was 14 and had been there for 7 years, so long that when authorities finally broke down the basement door, he couldn't remember his real name, couldn't remember where he had come from, could only identify himself as Samuel's child number 3 because that was what Father Samuel had called him for so long that his original identity had been completely erased. When Memphis police descended into that basement on August 12, 1869, following months of investigation, triggered by neighbors who reported hearing children crying at night from the church, they found 12 children living in conditions that the investigating officers described as worse than any prison they had ever seen. The children were chained to the walls at night to prevent them from escaping, forced to sleep on stone floors with only thin blankets, fed 1 meal per day consisting of bread and water, unless Father Samuel decided they had been sufficiently obedient to deserve actual food. They were covered in scars from beatings, burns from hot pokers Father Samuel used when they failed to memorize scripture correctly, and injuries from being forced to kneel on rough stone floors for hours at a time as punishment for sins that Father Samuel claimed to perceive in their hearts. Father Samuel, whose real name was Samuel Whitmore, told police that he was saving these children's souls, that they had come to him as orphans, runaways, and children of sinners, and that God had commanded him to purify them through discipline and isolation, to break their worldly natures and rebuild them as righteous servants of the Lord. He insisted that everything he had done was holy work, that the chains and beatings and starvation were acts of love designed to drive out the devil's influence, that the children should be grateful for the salvation he was providing through suffering that purified their souls and prepared them for heaven. But the investigation revealed a different story. Most of these children were not orphans. They had families who had been searching for them desperately, families who had reported them missing to police, who had failed to investigate thoroughly, families who had been told their children had probably run away or had fallen victim to accidents or violence common in post-Civil War Memphis. Father Samuel had been abducting children for at least 7 years, targeting children from poor families, children who played unsupervised in streets near his church, children whose disappearances might not trigger immediate, intensive investigation because they came from marginalized communities that police often ignored. Before we continue with the horrifying story of Father Samuel and the 12 children he imprisoned and tortured in his church basement while his congregation worshipped in the sanctuary directly above them, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from, because what happened in the Redemption Baptist Church basement and how Father Samuel was able to continue his crimes for 7 years while respected members of the Memphis community attended his services will disturb you in ways that stay long after this video ends. Memphis, Tennessee, in the years immediately following the Civil War, was a city in chaos and transition. The war had devastated the Southern economy and social structure, and Memphis, which had been occupied by Union forces since 1862, was struggling to rebuild while managing the massive social changes that came with emancipation and Reconstruction. The city's population had swelled with formerly enslaved people seeking opportunities and with refugees displaced by the war, creating overcrowded conditions and overwhelming the limited social services available. Into this chaos came Samuel Whitmore, arriving in Memphis in early 1862, claiming to be a Baptist preacher called by God to minister to the city's poor and displaced populations. Whitmore was approximately 40 years old, a thin man with intense eyes and a manner of speaking that combined biblical language with passionate conviction in ways that impressed people who heard him preach. He claimed to have come from Kentucky, where he said he had pastored a small church before the war, though later investigation would never confirm these claims or establish any verifiable history for Whitmore before his arrival in Memphis. Whitmore began by holding prayer meetings in rented rooms, attracting small crowds of people seeking spiritual comfort amid the uncertainties of wartime occupation. His preaching emphasized themes of sin and redemption, of the need for suffering and purification to achieve salvation, of the corruption of worldly life, and the necessity of withdrawing from society to live righteously. These messages resonated with some listeners who felt overwhelmed by the chaos around them, and who found comfort in Whitmore's certainty that earthly suffering would be rewarded in heaven. By 1863, Whitmore had gathered enough followers and financial contributions to purchase a small building on the outskirts of Memphis that he converted into Redemption Baptist Church. The building was a two-story structure with a large room on the ground floor that served as the sanctuary and a basement that had previously been used for storage but that Whitmore claimed he would convert into Sunday school classrooms and meeting spaces. The church attracted a congregation of perhaps 40 to 50 regular attendees, mostly poor white residents, and some free black people who were drawn by Whitmore's inclusive rhetoric about salvation being available to all who suffered and repented sufficiently. The church's location was somewhat isolated, separated from the nearest homes by several hundred yards and surrounded by undeveloped land that would eventually be incorporated into Memphis as the city expanded, but that in the 1860s remained largely empty. This isolation would prove significant later, as it meant that sounds from the church building were unlikely to reach neighbors, that Whitmore had relative privacy for whatever occurred in his church, and that children imprisoned in the basement could scream without being heard by anyone except those inside the building. Whitmore's theology, as expressed in his sermons and in writings he produced for his congregation, was dark and punitive. He preached that humanity was fundamentally corrupt, that even children were born with souls tainted by original sin, and that harsh discipline was necessary to drive out evil influences and create the conditions for God's grace to transform people. He quoted extensively from Old Testament passages about God's wrath and from New Testament verses about suffering and martyrdom, constructing a theological framework that portrayed pain and hardship as divinely ordained tools for spiritual purification. This theology troubled some members of his congregation who felt that Whitmore's emphasis on suffering and punishment was unbalanced, that his preaching lacked the love and mercy that were also central to Christian teaching. Several families left the church during its first year, uncomfortable with Whitmore's intensity and with his increasingly explicit claims that God spoke to him directly and commanded him to undertake special holy work that others might not understand. But those who remained became more devoted, viewing themselves as a chosen group that understood truths about salvation that mainstream Christianity had lost or compromised. It was in 1864 that Whitmore announced to his congregation that God had revealed to him a special mission. He was to gather children who were in spiritual danger, children whose souls were being corrupted by worldly influences or by the sinfulness of their parents, and he was to purify these children through intensive spiritual discipline that would drive out the devil's influence and prepare them to be perfect servants of God. He described this as a rescue mission, saving children who would otherwise be lost to eternal damnation, giving them the stern but necessary love that would ensure their salvation. Several congregation members were disturbed by this announcement and by Whitmore's vague descriptions of what this purification would involve. But Whitmore assured them that God had shown him exactly what needed to be done, that the methods might seem harsh to worldly eyes, but were necessary for spiritual transformation. He invited congregation members to bring children they believed needed special spiritual intervention, and several families, struggling with children they perceived as disobedient or troubled, accepted Whitmore's offer to provide intensive religious instruction. The first child to be placed in Whitmore's care was a 9-year-old boy named Thomas, whose mother was a widow struggling to support several children, and who hoped that Whitmore could instill discipline and religious values that she felt unable to provide on her own. Thomas was brought to the church in May 1864 with the understanding that he would stay for several weeks of intensive Bible study and spiritual guidance before returning home. But Thomas never came home. When his mother inquired about him after a month had passed, Whitmore told her that Thomas was making good progress but needed more time, that removing him prematurely would undo the spiritual work that had been accomplished. Months passed, then a year, with Whitmore providing occasional vague updates but never allowing Thomas's mother to see or speak with her son. By 1865, Whitmore had taken in 3 more children under similar arrangements, parents who were told their children would receive intensive religious instruction for limited periods, but who found that Whitmore never returned the children and provided increasingly hostile responses to requests for visits or updates. Some parents eventually stopped asking, intimidated by Whitmore's claims that their questioning revealed their own lack of faith, that God had commanded him to keep these children for their spiritual welfare, and that interfering with God's work would endanger their own salvation and their children's souls. But not all the children in Whitmore's basement came from families who had voluntarily placed them in his care. Starting in 1865, Whitmore began abducting children from the streets of Memphis, targeting children who were playing unsupervised, children from poor families who worked long hours and who could not constantly monitor their children, children whose disappearances might be attributed to the many dangers that existed in post-war Memphis rather than immediately suspected as abductions. Whitmore would approach children, claim to be a preacher who could help their families, offer candy or food, and lure them away to his church where they would be taken directly to the basement and locked in. The first child Whitmore abducted was a 7-year-old girl named Lucy, who had been playing near her family's home in a poor neighborhood when Whitmore approached her in August 1865. Lucy's parents reported her missing to police, who made minimal effort to investigate, assuming she had either run away or had met with an accident or violence that was common enough in Memphis that individual missing children cases rarely received sustained attention. Lucy's parents continued searching for months, posting notices, asking everyone they encountered if they had seen their daughter. But they never discovered that she was locked in the basement of a church less than 2 miles from their home. Over the following 4 years, Whitmore abducted at least 8 more children using similar methods. He targeted children between ages 4 and 12, children who were small enough to be physically controlled but old enough to be trained and disciplined, according to his theological vision. He showed preference for children who appeared shy or passive, children who were less likely to fight back or draw attention, children whose temperament suggested they might be broken more easily into the absolute obedience that Whitmore demanded. The basement where Whitmore kept these children was approximately 30 feet by 40 feet, with a ceiling height of about 7 feet, stone walls, and a dirt floor that Whitmore eventually covered with rough wooden planks. There were no windows. The basement was completely underground with no natural light source. Whitmore installed a heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs, leading from the sanctuary to the basement, and this door remained locked at all times except when Whitmore entered to deliver food, conduct religious instruction, or administer punishment. The children were kept in the basement 24 hours per day, with only rare exceptions. They were never allowed into the sanctuary above, never allowed outside, never allowed contact with anyone except Whitmore, and occasionally with 1 or 2 congregation members, whom Whitmore trusted to assist with his holy work without questioning his methods. The children slept on the floor, each having a thin blanket and a designated space where they were chained at night, using shackles attached to iron rings Whitmore had installed in the walls. During the day, the chains were removed, but the locked door and the absence of any escape route meant the children remained imprisoned regardless. Whitmore provided 1 meal per day, usually in the evening after his congregation had left following services. The meal typically consisted of bread and water, sometimes supplemented with beans or corn mush if Whitmore determined that the children had been particularly obedient, or if he needed them to have sufficient energy for the extended religious instruction sessions he conducted. Malnutrition was chronic and severe, with all the children showing stunted growth, extreme thinness, and health problems related to inadequate nutrition. The religious instruction that Whitmore provided was unlike anything that could be called education in any normal sense. He required the children to memorize vast portions of Scripture, testing them by having them recite passages on command and beating them with a leather strap when they made mistakes or hesitated. He focused particularly on passages about sin, punishment, obedience, and suffering, constructing a theological curriculum designed to convince the children that they were fundamentally evil, that their suffering was deserved punishment for their sinful natures, and that only absolute obedience to Whitmore as God's representative could possibly save their souls from eternal damnation. Whitmore also required the children to confess sins daily, and when children struggled to identify sins they had committed, Whitmore would suggest sins he claimed to perceive in their hearts: pride, doubt, hatred, lust, and other spiritual failings that he insisted contaminated their souls even if they had committed no outward acts. He would then administer punishment for these confessed or assigned sins, using the leather strap, but also employing other methods, including forcing children to kneel on sharp gravel or rough wood for extended periods, burning their hands or arms with hot pokers as purification through fire, and isolating individual children in complete darkness in a small storage room adjacent to the main basement for days at a time as punishment for particularly severe spiritual failings. The psychological effects of this treatment were devastating and were compounded by the children's complete isolation from any normal human interaction or affection. Whitmore never showed kindness or warmth to the children. Every interaction was either instructional or punitive, focused on breaking their wills and reforming them according to his vision of purified righteousness. The children had no contact with each other except during instruction sessions, as Whitmore forbade them from speaking to each other at other times, fearing that they would form attachments or conspiracies that would interfere with his individual control over each child. The children developed severe trauma symptoms that would later be documented by physicians who examined them after their rescue. They showed extreme fear responses to male authority figures, particularly men with beards similar to Whitmore's appearance. They had difficulty making eye contact and often stared at the ground when spoken to, having learned that looking directly at Whitmore was treated as defiance deserving punishment. They flinched at sudden movements or loud sounds, having been conditioned to expect violence. Many had developed speech difficulties, either speaking in barely audible whispers or having trouble forming words after years of being forbidden to speak freely. Whitmore's congregation remained largely unaware of what was occurring in the basement beneath their sanctuary. Whitmore had told congregation members that the basement was being used for special religious instruction for troubled children, that the work being done there was delicate and holy and should not be disturbed by casual visitors, and that God had commanded him to maintain strict confidentiality about the specific methods being employed to save these children's souls. Most congregation members accepted these explanations and did not question why they never saw the children or why the basement door remained locked during services. A few congregation members did express concerns, particularly women who felt uncomfortable with Whitmore's refusal to allow parents to visit their children, or with the occasional sounds that could be heard through the floor during services, sounds that might have been crying or screaming, but that Whitmore explained away as children working through spiritual crises, crying out to God for salvation in ways that sounded distressing, but that represented important spiritual breakthroughs. Some members who pressed these concerns found themselves denounced by Whitmore as lacking faith, as allowing worldly thinking to interfere with spiritual discernment, and several families left the congregation rather than continue to participate in a church where they felt increasingly uncomfortable. But enough congregation members remained loyal to Whitmore, accepting his authority and his claims of divine guidance, that the church continued to function and even to grow modestly through the late 1860s. Whitmore's preaching became more intense and apocalyptic, warning that the end times were approaching, that God's judgment would fall on those who compromised with worldly values, and that only those who accepted suffering and submitted completely to divine authority would be saved. This message attracted people who were frightened by the social changes occurring during Reconstruction, who felt that traditional values were being destroyed, and who found comfort in Whitmore's certainty that righteousness would ultimately triumph even if it required tremendous suffering in the present. By 1868, Whitmore had 12 children imprisoned in his basement, ranging in age from 2 to 13 at the time of their abduction or placement in his care. The overcrowding made conditions even worse than they had been when fewer children were present, as there was insufficient space for all of them to lie down simultaneously, insufficient air circulation to prevent the basement from becoming suffocatingly hot in summer or dangerously cold in winter, and insufficient sanitation facilities for 12 children who were confined 24 hours per day. The children developed survival strategies for coping with their imprisonment and abuse. They learned to memorize scripture with absolute precision, knowing that errors would result in beatings. They learned to confess sins enthusiastically, performing the self-accusation that Whitmore demanded with sufficient conviction that he would be satisfied and move on to interrogating another child. They learned to dissociate during punishments, separating their consciousness from the physical pain in ways that allowed them to survive repeated trauma. They learned to move silently, to avoid drawing Whitmore's attention, to become as invisible as possible in hope of being overlooked. Some children, particularly the younger ones who had been imprisoned for years and who had few or no memories of life before the basement, began to internalize Whitmore's theology, believing that they were genuinely sinful and evil, that their suffering was deserved, that Whitmore's treatment of them was an expression of divine love designed to save them from worse punishment in the afterlife. These children became Whitmore's most obedient subjects, enthusiastically confessing sins, accepting punishments without resistance, and sometimes even helping Whitmore by informing him of rule violations by other children. This internalization of abuse represented perhaps the most profound psychological damage Whitmore inflicted, creating self-hatred and acceptance of victimization that would prove extremely difficult to overcome even after rescue. The investigation that would eventually lead to the children's rescue began in late 1868, when a Memphis police officer named Robert Chen noticed patterns in missing children reports that suggested the disappearances might be connected rather than isolated incidents. Chen observed that several children had disappeared from neighborhoods near Redemption Baptist Church, that the disappearances had occurred over a period of years with similar methods. Children playing outside, who vanished suddenly with no witnesses or obvious explanation, and that this pattern suggested a predator operating in the area rather than random accidents or runaways. Chen began investigating Whitmore and his church, but he faced significant obstacles. Whitmore was respected in certain segments of Memphis society, viewed as a pious man doing charitable work with troubled children. His congregation included several prosperous merchants who contributed financially to his ministry and who vouched for his character when questioned. There was no physical evidence connecting Whitmore to any missing children, no witnesses who had seen him abducting anyone. Nothing beyond Chen's suspicions based on geographic and temporal patterns that could have been coincidental. Chen's investigation intensified in early 1869 when a man named Thomas Bridger moved into a house approximately 300 yards from Redemption Baptist Church. Bridger was a veteran of the Civil War who had been wounded and discharged, and he worked night shifts at a local factory, sleeping during the day and staying awake during late evening and night hours. Within weeks of moving into his house, Bridger began noticing sounds coming from the church at night, sounds that resembled children crying or screaming, sounds that occurred during hours when the church should have been empty and dark. Bridger initially dismissed these sounds as possibly cats or other animals, as wind creating strange noises in the building, or as his own imagination influenced by fatigue from night shift work. But the sounds continued, occurring 3 or 4 nights per week, always between midnight and dawn, always with the same quality of distress that suggested children rather than animals. Bridger eventually approached neighbors to ask if they had noticed the sounds, and he discovered that several other residents had heard similar noises, but had not investigated because they assumed the church must be conducting late-night prayer meetings or revival services that explained any sounds they heard. In March 1869, Bridger contacted police to report his concerns about the sounds from the church. His report was initially filed without follow-up, as police were overwhelmed with more immediate cases and saw no clear indication that a crime was occurring. But Bridger persisted, returning to the police station multiple times, keeping a written log of dates and times when he heard sounds from the church, and eventually connecting with Officer Chen, who immediately recognized that Bridger's observations might be evidence supporting the suspicions about Whitmore that Chen had been developing. Chen and Bridger began conducting surveillance of the church, watching the building during evening and night hours, documenting who entered and left, noting when lights were visible and when sounds could be heard. Their observations revealed that Whitmore typically arrived at the church in early evening, remained for several hours, and left late at night or in early morning hours. During his time in the church, sounds consistent with children crying or screaming could sometimes be heard, though not loudly enough to be certain without getting closer to the building than Chen felt prudent for maintaining surveillance. Chen also interviewed families whose children had disappeared in the vicinity of the church over the previous years, documenting a total of 9 missing children cases that fit the pattern he had identified. He spoke with congregation members, most of whom insisted that Whitmore was a righteous man doing God's work and that any suspicions about him were unfounded. But a few former congregation members, people who had left the church because they were uncomfortable with Whitmore's intensity or with aspects of his ministry they didn't fully understand, provided information that heightened Chen's concerns. One former congregation member, a woman named Martha Reynolds, told Chen that she had occasionally helped Whitmore with children in the church basement in 1865 and 1866, preparing meals and sometimes supervising children during religious instruction. Reynolds described the basement as dark and oppressive, said the children had seemed fearful and malnourished, and reported that Whitmore's methods of instruction had involved striking children with a leather strap when they made mistakes in recitation. Reynolds had stopped volunteering to help after a few months because she found the environment disturbing, but she had not reported concerns to police at the time because she had assumed that Whitmore knew what he was doing and that the harsh discipline was necessary for reforming troubled children as their parents had requested. Reynolds' testimony was crucial because it confirmed that children were being kept in the basement, that they were being subjected to physical punishment, and that their living conditions were poor. But it was not sufficient evidence for police to obtain a search warrant, as Reynolds' information was several years old, and described situations that Whitmore could potentially justify as legitimate religious instruction within the scope of authority that parents had given him. Chen needed more recent evidence, direct observation of criminal activity, or testimony from someone currently involved with the church that would provide legal justification for entering the building and searching the basement. The breakthrough came in July 1869, when a man named Jacob Stone, who had been attending Redemption Baptist Church for about a year, contacted Chen to report concerns. Stone explained that Whitmore had recently asked him to help with the holy work being done in the basement, that Stone had agreed and had been taken into the basement where he saw 12 children living in appalling conditions. Stone described children who were chained to walls, who were covered in bruises and scars, who flinched when adults approached them, who appeared terrified and malnourished. He reported that Whitmore had told him the children were being purified through suffering, that their spirits were being broken and rebuilt to be perfect servants of God, and that the harsh conditions and punishments were necessary and divinely commanded. Stone had been shocked by what he saw and had initially confronted Whitmore, arguing that the treatment of the children was cruel and contrary to Christian teaching about love and mercy. Whitmore had responded by accusing Stone of lacking faith, of allowing worldly sentiments to interfere with spiritual discernment, and of betraying God's work by questioning methods that God himself had revealed. Stone had left the church immediately and had spent several days wrestling with whether to report what he had seen, fearing that he might be wrong to question someone he had believed was a holy man, but ultimately concluding that what was occurring in that basement was abuse rather than salvation. Stone's testimony provided Chen with the evidence needed to obtain a search warrant. Chen presented the information to a judge, documenting the pattern of missing children, the sounds reported by neighbors, Martha Reynolds' historical testimony about children in the basement, and Stone's recent observation of 12 children living in cruel conditions. The judge issued a warrant authorizing police to search Redemption Baptist Church and specifically to investigate the basement that multiple witnesses had described. Chen organized a raid for early morning August 12, 1869, assembling a team of 8 officers and bringing a physician named Dr. William Morrison to provide immediate medical assessment of any children who might be found. The team arrived at the church at 6 o'clock in the morning, breaking down the front door when no one responded to their knocking, and immediately proceeding to the locked basement door that they broke down with sledgehammers. What they found in the basement exceeded even the worst expectations that Chen and his colleagues had developed. Based on witness testimony, 12 children were present, ranging in age from 4 to 14, all showing signs of severe malnutrition and abuse. The children were chained to the walls, having just been awakened by the sound of police breaking down the door, and they cowered in terror as officers entered, apparently believing that the police were associates of Whitmore's, who had come to punish them for some perceived sin or disobedience. Dr. Morrison later testified that his initial impression was that he had entered a torture chamber rather than a religious facility, that the conditions were comparable to the worst prisoner of war camps he had seen during the Civil War, and that he was shocked that children could have survived for years in such circumstances. The basement was dark, except for the small amount of light coming from the open door at the top of the stairs, and it took several minutes for officers' eyes to adjust enough to fully see the extent of the horror that had been hidden beneath the church sanctuary. The children were removed from their chains and carried out of the basement into daylight that several of them had not seen in years. Many of the children screamed or cried when exposed to sunlight, their eyes having adjusted to constant darkness to the point where normal light was painful. They were wrapped in blankets that officers had brought and were placed in wagons to be transported to a hospital where Dr. Morrison and other physicians could conduct thorough examinations and begin providing medical treatment. Samuel Whitmore was arrested at his home about an hour after the raid, having apparently been alerted that something was occurring at his church, but having made no attempt to flee. When confronted with the evidence of what had been found in the basement, Whitmore showed no remorse or acknowledgement that he had done anything wrong. He insisted that he had been following God's commands, that the children he had taken were being saved from eternal damnation, that the methods he employed were necessary for driving out the devil's influence and purifying souls that had been contaminated by worldly sin. Whitmore's absolute conviction that his actions had been righteous and divinely mandated disturbed even the police officers who arrested him, men who were accustomed to criminals making excuses or expressing regret to gain sympathy. Whitmore expressed neither excuses nor regret. He maintained that what he had done was holy work, that he would do it again if given the opportunity, and that those who condemned him were rejecting God's will and would face divine judgment for interfering with the salvation of the children he had been rescuing. The medical examinations of the 12 children revealed the full extent of the abuse they had suffered. All showed severe malnutrition, with weights far below normal ranges for their ages and heights. All had scars from beatings, with some children having dozens of scars at various stages of healing, indicating repeated abuse over extended periods. Several children had burn scars from hot pokers or brands. Many had injuries to their knees from being forced to kneel on sharp surfaces for extended periods. Several showed signs of broken bones that had healed improperly without medical treatment. The psychological damage was even more severe than the physical injuries. The children were mute, or nearly mute, having been trained to silence through violence, and now unable or unwilling to speak, even when encouraged by gentle physicians and nurses. They showed extreme fear of adult men, particularly anyone with physical similarity to Whitmore. They had difficulty making eye contact, maintaining what physicians recognized as the submissive posture of people who had been systematically broken through abuse. Several children showed no emotional response to kindness or comfort, having apparently learned that trust was dangerous and that the only safe response to any interaction was passive acceptance of whatever occurred. The process of identifying the children and locating their families proved challenging. Several of the children could not or would not provide their names, having either forgotten them after years of being called only by numbers or descriptors assigned by Whitmore, or having been so young when taken that they had never fully internalized their names before their abduction. Police worked from missing children reports, comparing physical descriptions and approximate ages to the children they had rescued, gradually matching most of the children to families who had reported them missing years earlier. The reunions between children and families were emotionally overwhelming and often difficult. Parents who had spent years searching for missing children, who had grieved and struggled with not knowing whether their children were alive or dead, suddenly had their children returned to them, but found that these children were profoundly damaged and could not immediately resume normal family relationships. The children didn't recognize parents they hadn't seen in years, particularly the younger children, who had been taken when they were very small and who had no conscious memories of their lives before Whitmore. They were terrified of the reunions, having been told by Whitmore that their families were sinful and dangerous, that they had been taken from their families to be saved, and that returning to their families would mean returning to evil influences that would corrupt their souls. Several families struggled to cope with the realization that their children had been imprisoned and tortured for years while they had been living their lives unaware, that their children had been suffering less than 2 miles from their homes while they had assumed their children were dead or had run away to other cities. The guilt and grief that parents experienced was profound, compounded by the practical challenges of caring for children who had been so severely traumatized that they required intensive medical and psychological support that most families had neither the resources nor the knowledge to provide. 3 of the 12 children were never successfully reunited with families. Despite extensive investigation and publicity about the case, no families came forward claiming these children, and the children themselves could not provide information about where they had come from or who their parents were. These 3 children remained in the care of charitable institutions, living in orphanages where staff did their best to provide care, but where the children continued to struggle with trauma symptoms and developmental problems resulting from their years of imprisonment and abuse. The trial of Samuel Whitmore began in November 1869 and attracted massive public attention, not just in Memphis but throughout Tennessee and the broader South. The case was seen as a test of how society would respond to crimes committed under the guise of religious authority, how the law would balance respect for religious practice with protection of children, and whether someone like Whitmore, who genuinely believed he was doing God's work, could be held criminally responsible for acts that he viewed as righteous, even if they caused terrible harm. Whitmore's defense attorneys, appointed by the court because Whitmore had no money to hire counsel, argued that Whitmore had been mentally ill, that his beliefs about divine commands to torture children were evidence of insanity rather than criminal intent, and that he should be committed to an asylum rather than imprisoned. They brought psychiatrists, who testified that Whitmore's absolute conviction that God spoke to him directly and commanded him to abuse children showed delusional thinking consistent with religious mania, a recognized form of insanity in 19th-century psychiatry. But the prosecution, led by Tennessee State Attorney Marcus Webb, argued that Whitmore's beliefs were not evidence of insanity, but rather evidence of evil, masked as righteousness, that Whitmore had known his actions would cause suffering and had chosen to continue precisely because he enjoyed the power and control that tormenting children provided. Webb pointed out that Whitmore had been methodical and organized in his crimes, had taken steps to hide what he was doing from his congregation and from neighbors, and had shown the calculated planning that was inconsistent with claims of insanity. Webb argued that calling Whitmore insane would set a dangerous precedent that would allow anyone who committed terrible acts to claim religious motivation as defense against criminal responsibility. The testimony during the trial was devastating and graphic, with physicians describing in detail the injuries they had documented on the children's bodies, with police officers describing the conditions in the basement where the children had been imprisoned, and with several of the older rescued children providing testimony about what they had experienced. The children's testimony was particularly powerful because they described not just physical abuse, but the psychological torture of being told constantly that they were evil, that their suffering was deserved, that no one would ever come to save them because they were too sinful to deserve rescue. One 13-year-old boy named Michael, who had been in Whitmore's basement for 6 years, testified about watching Whitmore beat younger children until they lost consciousness, about being forced to confess to sins he hadn't committed, and then being burned with hot pokers as punishment for those imaginary transgressions, about being kept in complete darkness in a storage room for 5 days as punishment for asking when he would be allowed to see his mother. Michael's testimony was particularly compelling because he could articulate not just what had happened, but how it had affected him psychologically, how he had learned to view himself as worthless and evil because Whitmore had told him so thousands of times while beating him. The defense attempted to cross-examine the child witnesses, trying to establish that their memories might be unreliable or that they had been coached by prosecutors to provide dramatic testimony, but these attempts backfired badly, as the children's obvious trauma and the consistency of their accounts across multiple witnesses made it clear that they were describing real experiences rather than fabricated stories. When defense attorneys pressed too aggressively in questioning child witnesses, several jurors visibly reacted with anger, and the judge warned defense counsel to moderate their approach or face sanctions for harassing traumatized children. Samuel Whitmore himself testified in his own defense, and his testimony proved damaging to his case despite his attorney's advice that he remain silent. Whitmore used the witness stand as a pulpit, preaching about sin and redemption, insisting that everything he had done was commanded by God and was necessary for saving the children's souls from eternal damnation. He showed no remorse, no acknowledgement that the children had suffered, no recognition that his actions might have been wrong. Instead, he maintained that the real crime was interfering with his holy work, that the police and prosecutors who had stopped him were servants of Satan trying to prevent children from achieving salvation. Whitmore's complete lack of remorse and his continued insistence that torturing children was righteous work apparently convinced jurors that he was not insane, but rather was someone who had constructed a theological framework to justify cruelty that he enjoyed inflicting. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges including kidnapping, assault, false imprisonment, and child endangerment. The judge sentenced Whitmore to life imprisonment, the maximum sentence available under Tennessee law at the time, stating from the bench that Whitmore represented a danger to children that required his permanent removal from society. Whitmore was sent to Tennessee State Prison, where he remained for the rest of his life, dying in 1891 at approximately age 70. He never expressed remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing, maintaining until his death that he had been imprisoned for following God's commands and that he would be vindicated in the afterlife when God's judgment revealed that his persecutors had been wrong. Fellow inmates reportedly avoided him, disturbed by his continued insistence that torturing children had been holy work and by his apparent inability to recognize the evil he had committed. The aftermath of the Whitmore case had lasting impacts on child protection law and on how religious institutions were regulated. Tennessee enacted new laws requiring religious organizations that took custody of children to register with state authorities and to allow regular inspections to ensure children's welfare. Other states adopted similar regulations, recognizing that religious authority could not be allowed to shield child abuse from legal accountability. These laws faced some resistance from religious communities that viewed them as government interference in religious practice, but the horror of the Whitmore case provided powerful justification for oversight that might prevent similar abuses. The 12 children who had been rescued from Whitmore's basement faced long and difficult recoveries. with outcomes varying significantly based on how long they had been imprisoned, how young they were when taken, and what resources were available to support their healing. The children who had been taken when they were older, and who had spent fewer years in captivity, generally recovered better, though all carried lasting trauma. The children who had been taken very young, and who had spent most of their developmental years in the basement, faced more severe challenges, as they had missed critical periods for social and emotional development, and had been shaped by abuse during years when normal children would have been learning trust, autonomy, and basic life skills. Several of the rescued children never fully recovered their ability to function independently. They struggled with basic social interactions, had difficulty maintaining employment, and remained fearful and hypervigilant throughout their lives. Some remained in institutional care into adulthood, never developing the capacity to live independently because their early trauma had been so profound and their development had been so disrupted during critical years. Others showed remarkable resilience, gradually recovering their ability to trust, to form relationships, and to build relatively normal lives despite their traumatic experiences. These children benefited from families who were patient and supportive, from communities that provided practical and emotional assistance, and from their own internal strength that allowed them to process trauma and move forward rather than remaining psychologically trapped in the basement where they had suffered. Michael, the 13-year-old who had testified so powerfully at Whitmore's trial, became an advocate for child protection, working with charitable organizations to identify and assist abused children. He spoke publicly about his experiences throughout his life, describing what he had endured and how he had survived, hoping that his testimony might help others recognize abuse and intervene before children suffered for years as he had. Michael died in 1924 at age 68, having dedicated much of his life to ensuring that what happened to him and his fellow captives would not happen to other children. The physical building that had housed Redemption Baptist Church was burned down by an angry mob about a week after Whitmore's arrest, with Memphis authorities making no serious attempt to stop the destruction or to prosecute those responsible. The congregation had dissolved immediately after the discovery of the children in the basement, with former members expressing shock and horror about what had been occurring beneath them during worship services. Some former congregation members faced social ostracism and accusations that they should have known what Whitmore was doing, that they bore some responsibility for not investigating more thoroughly or questioning more aggressively when they heard sounds or noticed signs that something might be wrong. Several former congregation members, particularly those who had brought their own children to Whitmore for religious instruction only to have those children imprisoned and abused, never recovered from the guilt and grief of having trusted Whitmore and having inadvertently placed their children in danger. At least 2 parents of rescued children committed suicide in the years following the case, unable to cope with the knowledge that they had given their children to someone who had tortured them, unable to forgive themselves even though they had been deceived by Whitmore's religious rhetoric and apparent piety. The Whitmore case also influenced how law enforcement agencies responded to reports about religious institutions. Prior to this case, police had been extremely reluctant to investigate churches or religious leaders, viewing religious institutions as outside the proper scope of secular authority and fearing accusations of religious persecution if they investigated spiritual leaders. But the Whitmore case demonstrated that religious authority could be abused to shield terrible crimes, that piety could mask evil, and that respecting religious freedom could not mean ignoring evidence of child abuse occurring under religious cover. Memphis police officer Robert Chen, whose investigation had led to the discovery of the children in Whitmore's basement, became a specialist in cases involving crimes against children and worked throughout his career to improve how police responded to reports of missing or abused children. Chen developed protocols for investigating child disappearances that emphasized quick response, thorough documentation, and willingness to investigate all possibilities including abduction by respected community members. His work influenced child protection policies, not just in Memphis, but throughout Tennessee and eventually in other states as law enforcement agencies shared best practices. The psychological understanding of child trauma was limited in the 1870s, and many of the rescued children did not receive the kind of specialized mental health care that would be considered essential for abuse survivors today. But some physicians and charitable workers recognized that the children needed more than just physical healing, that addressing their psychological wounds was crucial for recovery. Organizations emerged that focused specifically on helping traumatized children, providing counseling, safe environments, and gradual reintegration into normal life, rather than expecting children to simply return to their families and resume normal activities. These early child trauma programs were crude by modern standards, often relying on religious instruction, ironically, as a method for counteracting the religious abuse the children had experienced, trying to teach them that God was loving rather than punishing, that Christianity properly understood emphasized mercy rather than cruelty. But despite their limitations, these programs represented important recognition that trauma had lasting psychological effects that required deliberate intervention and support, that children who had been severely abused could not simply get over it, but needed help processing their experiences and rebuilding their sense of safety and self-worth. The broader social impact of the Whitmore case included increased skepticism about religious authority and recognition that religious rhetoric could be used to manipulate and deceive. In the immediate aftermath of the case, church attendance in Memphis declined as people questioned whether they could trust religious leaders, whether piety might mask evil, whether institutions they had respected were really worthy of that respect. Some religious leaders responded defensively, arguing that Whitmore was an aberration and that most religious institutions were safe and beneficial. Others acknowledged that the case revealed serious problems, that religious communities needed to be more transparent and accountable, and that claims of divine authority could not be allowed to shield abuse from scrutiny. The case also contributed to growing awareness of child abuse as a social problem requiring systematic response, rather than being treated as isolated incidents to be handled privately within families or institutions. Prior to cases like Whitmore's, child abuse was often viewed as a private matter, something that might be unfortunate, but that was not properly the subject of public intervention or legal action. The Whitmore case demonstrated that child abuse could be systematic and severe, that children subjected to prolonged abuse suffered profound damage, and that protecting children required public authorities to investigate and intervene, even when doing so meant questioning respected institutions or challenging claims of religious or parental authority. By the early 20th century, all American states had enacted child protection laws influenced at least partly by cases like Whitmore's, establishing that protecting children from abuse was a legitimate function of government, creating legal mechanisms for removing children from abusive situations, and defining criminal penalties for adults who harmed children. These laws were inconsistently enforced and often failed to protect children adequately, but they represented important recognition that children had rights that deserved legal protection, and that adults who abused children should face criminal consequences. Modern understanding of child abuse and trauma allows us to better appreciate what the children in Whitmore's basement experienced and endured. Contemporary psychologists recognize that prolonged abuse by trusted authority figures, particularly abuse that occurs during critical developmental periods, causes profound and lasting psychological damage. The children kept by Whitmore experience what we would now call complex developmental trauma, resulting from repeated abuse over extended periods during childhood years when brain development and psychological identity formation were occurring. The symptoms these children exhibited: difficulty trusting others, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, dissociation, self-hatred, difficulty regulating emotions, are now recognized as typical responses to severe childhood trauma. Understanding these symptoms as trauma responses, rather than as character flaws or permanent damage, helps frame recovery as possible, even if difficult, and helps guide interventions designed to help survivors rebuild their sense of safety, their ability to trust, and their capacity for healthy relationships. The theological justifications that Whitmore used to rationalize his abuse of children are also better understood through modern research on how perpetrators manipulate religious language to gain trust and shield abuse from detection. Whitmore used several common tactics: claiming direct communication with God that others couldn't question, constructing theological frameworks that portrayed cruelty as love, isolating victims from other perspectives that might challenge his authority, and presenting himself publicly as righteous while hiding his actual behavior. These tactics are now recognized as warning signs that should trigger scrutiny rather than being accepted as evidence of authentic piety. The question of whether Whitmore was insane, as his defense attorneys argued, or whether he was simply evil, as prosecutors maintained, reflects broader questions about the relationship between belief and responsibility. Whitmore genuinely believed that God commanded him to torture children, and this belief was sincere in the sense that he maintained it consistently and never showed awareness that it might be false. But sincerity of belief does not eliminate responsibility for harmful actions, and Whitmore's methodical planning and his efforts to hide his activities from scrutiny demonstrate that he knew others would object to what he was doing, even if he believed God approved. Modern legal and psychiatric frameworks generally distinguish between delusions that completely eliminate capacity to understand right from wrong, which might support an insanity defense, and beliefs that are unusual or even irrational, but that don't eliminate awareness that one's actions are legally and socially condemned. Whitmore understood that society viewed torturing children as wrong, which is why he hid his activities and constructed theological justifications for them. His belief that God commanded these actions didn't eliminate his awareness that human authorities would condemn them, and this awareness supports treating him as criminally responsible for his choices. The legacy of Samuel Whitmore and the 12 children he imprisoned is preserved in court records, newspaper archives, medical case studies, and in the memories passed down through families affected by the case. The children's suffering was not meaningless. Their testimony helped convict their abuser, their case led to legal reforms that protected other children, and their survival demonstrated human resilience, even in the face of terrible trauma. But their suffering was also not necessary or redemptive in any sense that Whitmore claimed. It was simply cruelty inflicted by someone who used religion to justify enjoying power over helpless victims. The site where Redemption Baptist Church stood in Memphis is now occupied by commercial buildings, with no marker or memorial indicating what occurred there in the 1860s. The basement where 12 children were imprisoned and tortured was filled in when the burned church building was demolished, and the physical space where so much suffering occurred has been erased from the landscape. Only documentary records and historical memory preserve the knowledge of what happened in that basement, beneath a church sanctuary where people worshipped, unaware that children were being tortured below them. Several of the rescued children, including Michael, were buried in Memphis cemeteries when they died decades after their rescue. Their graves are marked with simple headstones that give no indication of what they survived, identifying them simply by name and dates without reference to the trauma that defined much of their lives. For most people who visit these graves, or who pass through the neighborhoods where the children once lived, there is no visible reminder of the Whitmore case or of the suffering these children endured. But among historians studying child abuse, among mental health professionals working with trauma survivors, and among child protection advocates working to identify and stop abuse, the Whitmore case remains important as documentation of how child abuse can occur in plain sight when perpetrators use respected institutions and religious rhetoric to shield their crimes. The case demonstrates that warning signs of abuse, unexplained disappearances of children, sounds of distress from supposedly safe places, reluctance to allow access or transparency deserve serious investigation even when they involve respected community members or religious institutions. The case also demonstrates the importance of believing children who report abuse, of taking seriously the testimony of victims, even when their accounts seem extreme or when perpetrators present convincing alternative explanations. The children in Whitmore's basement endured years of torture, partly because adults around them failed to investigate thoroughly when presented with warning signs, failed to question religious authority sufficiently, and failed to act on concerns that seemed too terrible to be true. Their suffering might have been shortened if neighbors had insisted on investigating the sounds they heard, if congregation members had demanded transparency about what was happening in the locked basement, if police had taken missing children reports more seriously and had investigated patterns rather than treating each case as isolated. Samuel Whitmore represents a particular type of perpetrator, someone who uses religious authority and theological language to gain trust, to isolate victims, to justify cruelty, and to shield abuse from detection. This type of perpetrator remains a threat in contemporary society, operating in churches, religious schools, and other faith-based institutions where claims of divine authority can create environments where abuse flourishes undetected. Recognizing the tactics that perpetrators like Whitmore use helps communities protect children by maintaining appropriate skepticism about authority, by ensuring transparency and accountability in religious institutions, and by creating environments where children feel safe reporting abuse even when perpetrators are respected religious leaders. The 12 children who survived Whitmore's abuse carried their trauma throughout their lives, but many of them also carried strength and resilience that allowed them to build meaningful lives despite what they had endured. Their survival and recovery, imperfect and incomplete as it was, demonstrates that trauma does not have to be destiny, that healing is possible even after terrible abuse, and that human beings have remarkable capacity to preserve their humanity even when subjected to systematic efforts to destroy it. What do you think about the Whitmore case? How could an entire congregation worship above a basement where children were being tortured without anyone investigating thoroughly? What does this case tell us about the dangers of unquestioned religious authority? How do we balance respect for religious institutions with the need to protect children from abuse that occurs under religious cover? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried. It's just waiting in the shadows.